As Chikwado bent down to pick up the shiny coin near the towering Iroko tree, she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. Before she could react, the tree's twisted roots came to life, snaking around her ankles and pulling her into the earth. Her scream was swallowed by the wind. What happened next would reveal a terror the village had never imagined. Once upon a time, in the quiet village of Umodike, there stood an ancient tree, large and towering over the small homes and fields that surrounded it. The villagers called the tree Osisi Baluafo because it was old, mysterious, and had stood there for as long as anyone could remember. Its trunk was thick and twisted, and its branches reached high into the sky like arms to touch the heavens. The tree was beautiful, but also strange, and some people said it had a life of its own. Everyone in the village respected the tree, but over time, something dark and terrifying began to happen. Children, bright and lively children, started to disappear. They would leave their homes to play outside and never return. Some villagers thought the children had wandered off into the nearby forest and gotten lost. Others feared that wild animals might have taken them, but no one knew for sure what was happening, and the village became a place of fear. Then one day, Chikwado, the brightest and most beloved child in the village, disappeared and everything changed. Chikwado was no ordinary child. She was the long-awaited daughter of Mr. Okachi and Mrs. Nina, a couple who had been married for 7 years before they were blessed with her. For those 7 long years, they had prayed and hoped for a child, and when Chikwado was born, they felt as though all their prayers had been answered. She was their miracle, a child sent from heaven to bring them joy. From the moment she was born, Chikwado filled her parents' home with laughter and love. She had big, curious eyes that sparkled with wonder, and a broad smile that seemed to make even the darkest days feel sunny. Everywhere she went, people admired her. She was a brilliant child, always asking questions and exploring the world around her. "Why does the moon follow me at night?" she once asked her father, Mr. Okachi, while they were walking home after a long day at the market. He chuckled and ruffled her hair, unsure of how to explain the mysteries of the world to his curious daughter. Chikwado was also bold and brave. While other children ran away from things that scared them, she stood her ground. She loved to explore the fields and climb trees, and she wasn't afraid of much. Even when a snake slithered across the path one day while she was playing outside, she didn't scream or cry like other children might. Instead, she stood still, watching the snake with wide eyes until it disappeared into the grass. Her parents loved her with all their hearts. They often called her their consolidated gift, because after waiting so many years, Chikwado's birth had made up for all the pain and tears they had endured. She was their everything, and they couldn't imagine life without her. One warm afternoon, Chikwado went outside to play with her friends. It was a bright and sunny day, and the fields around the village were filled with the sounds of children laughing and running. Chikwado's mother, Nina, watched her daughter from the doorway, smiling as she saw her little girl running and playing, her laughter filling the air. "Don't go too far," Nina called out, her voice filled with warmth. "Stay where I can see you." "Yes, Mama," Chikwado called back, waving to her mother before running off with her friends. As the children played, their laughter echoed through the village, and the day seemed perfect. But as the afternoon wore on, Chikwado's curiosity began to take over. She had always been an adventurous child, and sometimes her curiosity led her to explore places she wasn't supposed to go. That day, as she and her friends ran through the fields, something caught her eye. It was a small, shiny object lying near the base of the old Iroko tree. The other children had always been told to stay away from the tree, but Chikwado, being bold and curious, couldn't resist. She ran ahead of her friends, her eyes fixed on the shiny object. When she reached the tree, she bent down to pick it up. It was a small silver coin, glinting in the sunlight. Chikwado smiled as she held it in her hand, wondering how such a treasure had ended up by the tree. But as she stood up, something strange happened. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and before she could react, the roots of the Iroko tree moved. They slithered out of the ground like giant snakes and wrapped themselves around Chikwado's ankles. Chikwado gasped and tried to pull herself free, but the roots were too strong. They tightened around her legs and started pulling her towards the tree. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. In a matter of seconds, the roots pulled her into the ground and Chikwado disappeared. When the sun began to set that evening, Chikwado's mother, Nina, called for her daughter to come inside. "Chikwado! Chikwado!" she called from the doorway, expecting to see her daughter running home with that bright smile on her face. But there was no answer. At first, Nina wasn't too worried. Sometimes Chikwado lost track of time when she was playing outside, but she always came home eventually. Still, as the minutes turned into hours and the sky grew darker, Nina began to feel a growing sense of unease. "Okachi, where is Chikwado?" she asked her husband, her voice trembling with worry. Mr. Okachi frowned and stepped outside, calling out for their daughter. "Chikwado, it's time to come home." But there was no sign of her. As the night grew darker, Nina's worry turned into panic. She ran to the neighbors' homes, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. Mr. Okachi joined her, and soon the whole village was searching for Chikwado. They searched the fields, the roads, the nearby forest, calling her name over and over again, but there was no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The next morning, when the sun rose, the villagers continued their search, but as the hours passed, hope began to fade. Chikwado was nowhere to be found, and no one knew what had happened to her. Nina was devastated. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep, and all she could think about was her precious daughter. Every night she would sit by the window, hoping and praying that Chikwado would come running home, her laughter filling the air once again. But each night, she was met with silence. "Where is my daughter?" she cried to anyone who would listen. "Where is my Chikwado?" Mr. Okachi tried to stay strong for his wife, but he was heartbroken as well. Chikwado had been the light of their lives, and now that light was gone. The house that had once been filled with laughter was now filled with sorrow. As days turned into weeks, the village of Umudike was gripped with fear. Chikwado wasn't the only child who had disappeared. Over the past few months, several other children had gone missing, and no one knew where they had gone. Some people whispered that the children had been taken by wild animals, while others believed they had wandered too far into the forest and gotten lost. But after Chikwado's disappearance, the villagers began to suspect something far more sinister. They had always known that the old Iroko tree was strange, but now they began to wonder if it had something to do with the missing children. Some villagers claimed they had seen shadows moving near the tree, shadows that didn't belong to any person or animal. Others said they had heard strange whispers coming from the tree at night, but no one dared to go near the tree to find out if the stories were true. The mystery of the missing children hung over the village like a dark cloud. Parents kept their children close, too afraid to let them play outside. The once lively fields were now empty and silent. One evening, a village hunter called Okafor was walking near the Iroko tree on his way back from the forest. Okafor was known for being brave, and he wasn't afraid of the stories that had been told about the tree. As he passed by, something caught his eye. A small piece of cloth stuck to one of the tree's roots. He bent down to pick it up and realized it was a ribbon, a colorful ribbon that had once belonged to Chikwado. Okafor's heart raced as he stared at the ribbon in his hand. Could it be true? Could the tree have taken Chikwado? Without wasting any time, Okafor ran back to the village, his breath coming in short gasps. "It's the tree!" he shouted as he reached the village square. "The tree took her! The tree is eating the children!" The villagers gathered around, listening in shock as Okafor explained what he had found. At first, some people didn't believe him. How could a tree eat children? It sounded impossible. But as more people came forward with stories of strange things they had seen near the tree, the villagers began to believe that the old Iroko tree was behind the mysterious disappearances. Fear and anger spread through the village like wildfire. The thought that the tree had taken their beloved children filled the villagers with horror. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. The youths of the village, led by Okafor and some of the bravest men, decided that they could no longer stand by while the tree continued to claim the lives of their children. They would cut it down once and for all. The news spread throughout the village, and soon everyone was preparing for the task ahead. On the night of the planned attack, the air was thick with tension. The men gathered their tools, axes, machetes, and torches, ready to face the ancient tree that had haunted their village for so long. The women and older men stayed behind, praying and watching anxiously as the youths marched towards the tree, their faces set with determination. Nina, though weak from grief, stood at the edge of the crowd, clutching her husband's arm tightly. Her heart was heavy with sorrow, but she hoped that by cutting down the tree, they might finally find answers about what had happened to her beloved Chikwado. The men approached the tree cautiously, its towering presence casting long shadows over them. As they circled the tree, they could feel the strange energy that seemed to radiate from it. The branches swayed gently in the night breeze, but it felt as though the tree was watching them, waiting. With a deep breath, Okafor raised his axe and swung it toward the tree's trunk. The sound of the axe hitting the wood echoed through the night, and the tree seemed to shudder in response. The other men followed suit, their axes and machetes striking the tree with force. With each blow, the tree groaned, as if it were alive, as if it were in pain. The villagers watched in silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. Nina stood beside her husband, her eyes filled with tears. She prayed silently, hoping that they will find Chikwado and the other missing children. As the men continued to chop at the tree, strange things began to happen. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick with an air of silence. Some of the men hesitated, fear gripping their hearts, but they pressed on. They knew they couldn't stop now. After what felt like hours of chopping and hacking, the tree finally began to crack. A deep thunderous sound filled the air as the Iroko tree slowly began to fall. The ground shook as its massive trunk crashed to the earth, sending dust and debris flying in all directions. For a moment, everything was still. The villagers held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. As the dust settled, the villagers gasped in horror at what they saw. Inside the hollow trunk of the tree, the bodies of the missing children were revealed. They were tangled in the tree's roots, their small forms lifeless and covered in dirt and leaves. Among them was Chikwado, her once bright eyes now closed, her little body still and cold. Nina let out a cry of pure anguish, her knees buckling beneath her as she collapsed to the ground. "My Chikwado," she sobbed, her heart breaking into a million pieces. Mr. Okachi knelt beside her, his arms wrapped around his wife, but he too was overcome with grief. Their precious daughter, the child they had waited so long for, was gone. The other villagers stood in stunned silence, tears streaming down their faces as they looked at the heartbreaking scene before them. The children they had searched for, the children they had loved, had been trapped inside the tree all along. The truth was more terrible than they had ever imagined. The tree had been alive, feeding off the children's lives, trapping them in its twisted roots. And now that the tree was gone, the village was left with the painful task of burying their beloved children and trying to move on from the tragedy that had befallen them. In the days that followed, the village of Omodike was overcome with sorrow. The children were buried in a quiet ceremony, and the entire village mourned together. The pain of losing Chikwado and the other children was too much to bear, and it would take a long time for the village to heal. Nina and Okachi were devastated. Their home, once filled with laughter and love, was now silent and empty. Nina couldn't bring herself to go into Chikwado's room. Everything in there reminded her of her little girl. The toys, the books, the small bed where Chikwado had once slept. It was too painful to face the reminders of the daughter they had lost. Mr. Okachi, though heartbroken, tried to stay strong for his wife, but he too felt the weight of their loss crushing down on him. Every day, he would walk through the village, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if he still expected to see Chikwado running towards him with that bright smile on her face. But she was gone, and nothing could bring her back. The villagers, though united in their grief, did their best to support one another. They knew that they would have to rebuild their lives, but the memory of the tragedy would stay with them forever. And so, the legend of the old Iroko tree, the tree that had swallowed the children, became part of the village's history. But more than that, it became a story of love, a story about a little girl named Chikwado who had been a miracle, a light, and a gift to all who had known her. If you enjoy the story and will want us to continue to share more interesting stories, please kindly subscribe so you can be notified when we drop new content. How do you feel about today's story? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you next time.